If you're a fan of werewolf and vampire stories, at some point you must have wondered how it all began in the eternal battle between vampires and werewolves, right? Where does this visceral hatred come from that has driven these two supernatural creatures to clash for millennia, never reaching a conclusion? Most people think it's just a power struggle, a fight for territory or survival. But it's not that at all. It all began with a biblical curse, one far deeper and older than the stories we usually hear. Yes, the origin of this conflict goes back to Cain, the first murderer in human history, and the curse that not only turned him into the first vampire, but also set off a chain of events that shaped the battle between these creatures. Surprisingly, it's not just the sharp claws of the werewolves or the bloodthirsty fangs of the vampires that fuel this rivalry. There's a web of hidden motives in the shadows of history, involving angels, gods, and a natural balance that was broken. What few people know is that, deep down, these mortal enemies aren't just fighting each other. They're battling their own curses, seeking a redemption that may never come. But if they're destined to fight forever, what can we learn from this? And here's the big revelation. Understanding the true origin of this rivalry not only makes us see these creatures in a new light, but it also reveals a lot about humanity itself and our internal struggles. You'll discover how ancient legends from civilizations like the Greeks, Egyptians, and Norse helped shape this supernatural war. More importantly, though, you'll see what this conflict teaches us about power, corruption, and, of course, the choices that define us. Ready to dive into this story full of mythology, legends, and rivalries that transcend time? Then come with me and prepare to uncover the true origin of the battle between werewolves and vampires. A long time ago, the myth of Cain, the first murderer in biblical history, became linked to the origin of vampires. After the terrible act of taking his brother Abel's life, Cain was cursed by God. His curse, however, went beyond wandering the earth forever. Legend has it that this divine mark included an insatiable thirst for blood, turning him into the first vampire. Thus, he was condemned to roam the dark nights, a creature who would never find peace. This directly connects vampires to an ancient story of betrayal and damnation, something many people overlook when delving into Christian mythology and its implications. This idea of vampires as descendants of Cain ties the figure of bloodsuckers to guilt and divine punishment. It's as if Cain's act could never be forgotten, reflected in every vampire that emerges. Every time one of them feeds, they relive their ancestors' curse, doomed to repeat the cycle of sin and penance. And here's an interesting point. Unlike other mythologies where gods distance themselves from supernatural creatures, Cain's figure suggests a direct relationship with the divine plan and human suffering, an eternal cycle that transcends generations. In various ancient cultures like Greek and Roman civilizations, the idea of cursed creatures with a thirst for blood also exists, but few connect so strongly to the Bible. It's fascinating to think that something so popular in folklore, like vampires, could have roots in such an ancient story. These legends have spread over the centuries, evolving to include different interpretations, but the essence remains: the blood curse. In other words, Cain, the first vampire, is a reflection of the pain and eternal thirst for something that could never return his humanity. This connection to Christian mythology also brings an interesting aspect to the nature of vampires, what they represent. They're not just monsters, but beings that symbolize the weight of our decisions and how a single choice can condemn someone forever. Like Cain, vampires face the consequences of their actions for eternity, forced to exist in the shadows, without redemption. By exploring these stories, one can see how mythology and religion go hand in hand, and how mythological figures like vampires have much more to say about our own history. Now, let's see how this narrative of the curse connects to another aspect: the pleasure and pain that the act of drinking blood brings to vampires. It's as if this thirst has a dual component, much more complex than a mere physical need. What does the pleasure Cain felt when spilling Abel's blood have to do with this? Let's find out more below. The bloodlust that defines vampires isn't just a physiological need. It involves a twisted cycle of pleasure and pain, intricately tied to the myth of Cain. When Cain spilled Abel's blood, legend has it that he experienced a dark, profound pleasure, adding even more layers to his curse. It wasn't just the act of murder that condemned him, but the pleasure he took in taking a life. This pleasure resurfaces in vampires whenever they feed, making the act of drinking blood both addictive and painfully necessary. Imagine living with this duality. Every sip of blood a vampire takes brings an indescribable ecstasy, but at the same time, it feeds the guilt that gnaws at their soul. It's as if they are eternally forced to relive Cain's first betrayal, tasting the bitter curse with each drop. This combination of pleasure and pain turns the vampire into a tragic figure, incapable of breaking free from this cycle. It's easy to draw parallels to human addictions, where momentary pleasure is followed by a weight of regret, showing how vampire folklore reflects aspects of the human condition. Throughout history, this duality of pleasure and pain has been portrayed in various mythologies. In ancient civilizations like the Celts, there were stories of creatures who fed on the living, often with sadistic pleasure. However, in the case of vampires, the act of feeding carries the mark of eternal suffering. It's as if the thirst for blood is also a thirst for redemption, one that will never be quenched. Like Cain, they are trapped in an existence that denies them peace, feeling the pain that accompanies the pleasure every time they give in to their nature. And it's interesting how this image of pleasure and pain has spread through literature and popular culture. From the classic vampires to the modern ones, this tension between insatiable hunger and guilt persists. And Rice, for example, portrays this inner struggle in vampires with a depth that captivates readers. They are much more than predators. They are beings who suffer through every moment of their existence. It makes us reflect. How far are we willing to go for pleasure, knowing it comes with pain? In this sense, the vampire is a reflection of that inner conflict we all face. This dynamic of pleasure and pain is also what strengthens the bond between vampires and their ancestor, Cain. Every act of quenching their thirst is a return to that first sin, that first forbidden pleasure. But what they don't know, or perhaps refuse to accept, is that this cycle is also a form of imprisonment. They will never truly be free. And to complicate things further, angels are also involved in this invisible war, seeking to control the proliferation of these cursed creatures. Let's see next how celestial interference plays its role in this story. Angels, celestial beings we typically associate with peace and protection, also play a crucial role in the war against vampires. After the flood, when the earth was cleansed of humanity's sins, the proliferation of vampires worried the divine forces. Cain's power, passed down from generation to generation, threatened the balance of creation. It was at this point that the angels, obeying higher orders, intervened to prevent these children of the night from dominating the world. After all, the vampires carried not just a thirst for blood, but the corruption of Cain's soul, which the angels knew could not be allowed to spread. However, the war waged by the angels against the vampires wasn't a physical battle as we often imagine. It involved the control of spiritual forces that govern the world. The angels couldn't completely eradicate the vampires, as Cain's curse was as old and deep as human existence itself. What they could do was limit the influence of these creatures, restricting their powers and acting in the shadows, maintaining the balance between light and dark. The vampires, in turn, feel this invisible pressure, a force constantly trying to contain them, which is why many of them live on the fringes, in hiding. The involvement of angels also raises questions about free will and the battle for souls. Vampires, as descendants of Cain, are a reminder that not every creature is beyond salvation. There are legends that say some angels, moved by compassion, tried to redeem individual vampires, offering them a chance to break the curse. But these attempts were almost always in vain. After all, the weight of the thirst for blood, of pleasure and pain, is a prison that's hard to escape. Even so, the idea of an ongoing spiritual war between vampires and angels adds a layer of depth to these creature stories. It's also interesting how other mythologies have equivalents to these battles between supernatural forces. In Norse traditions, for example, the Aesir gods and the giants were constantly at war, a balance that mirrors the struggle between light and darkness in the Christian world. This parallel shows us that, in various cultures, the idea of superior beings intervening in the fate of earthly creatures has always been present. And in the case of vampires, angels became the guardians of divine order, ensuring that the chaotic forces of Cain's curse wouldn't exceed the limits imposed by heaven. Finally, this invisible war between angels and vampires not only defines the course of these creatures' history, but also hints at the future. After all, if angels are the celestial guardians, who would be the perfect earthly hunter? This is where Cain's brother, Cain, comes in, cursed by Noah and destined to become the first vampire hunter. He is the bridge between the celestial and mortal worlds, and his transformation is something that needs to be understood to grasp the true balance between these two forces. Cain, the son of Noah, also carried an immense burden throughout his existence. When Cain's curse gave rise to vampires, Cain's fate was sealed by another blessing disguised as punishment. A stranger, noticing Cain's sadness over disappointing his father Noah by appearing naked before him, promised to resolve the problem if Cain agreed to a pact. And, in his sorrow, Cain accepted. The stranger, who was actually an angel of God, cast a new curse upon Cain, transforming him into something fiercer, something that could confront the darkness head-on. Thus, Cain became the first werewolf, a creature destined to hunt vampires, serving as a natural force opposing Cain's curse. With heightened senses and unmatched strength, he would become the perfect weapon against Cain's descendants. The creation of werewolves, therefore, arose as a response to the proliferation of vampires. In his new form, Cain was relentless, driven by the duty to hunt these cursed creatures. This transformation not only gave him power, but also tied him directly to the lunar cycle, turning him into a being that channeled the wild energy of the earth. Unlike vampires, who fed on blood and guilt, werewolves were connected to nature, acting as its guardians and protectors. This relationship with the earth reinforces the idea that they are more than mere hunters. They are a force of balance, safeguarding the natural world from the corruption brought by vampires. Historically, this lineage of werewolf hunters spread across the world, with their legends emerging in many ancient cultures. In Greek and Roman mythology, stories of men turning into beasts can be found in tales like that of Cain, the king transformed into a wolf by Zeus. In Celtic mythology, there are also mentions of warriors who transformed into wolves during hunting rituals. These stories reflect the archetype of the werewolf as the ultimate hunter, a figure who, despite their savagery, has a defined purpose: to maintain the balance between the forces of good and evil. However, Cain's curse was not without its consequences. Just as vampires struggle with their bloodlust, werewolves grapple with the loss of control over themselves. Under the full moon's light, many lose their humanity, becoming creatures driven solely by their predatory instincts. This brings a tragedy similar to that of the vampires, for while they are hunters, they are also trapped in a cursed cycle, condemned to live between the human and the bestial. Over the ages, werewolves began to hunt not only vampires but any creature that threatened Earth's balance, becoming both hunters and guardians. And it's in this duality that we find the true conflict between these two cursed lineages. Vampires and werewolves are natural enemies, but at the same time, both are bound to curses that place them in constant conflict with themselves. The power of each is a reflection of a greater force that created them: Cain's curse and Cain's transformation. However, within the vampire hierarchy, those further from Cain begin to lose strength, creating an advantage for the werewolves and initiating a new power dynamic. Let's explore this hierarchy in the next section. In the world of vampires, the direct lineage of Cain carries significant weight. Those closest to his bloodline are the most powerful, endowed with abilities that make them nearly invincible. These vampires, known as elders, are feared not only for their physical strength, but also for the wisdom they have acquired over the centuries. Being directly connected to Cain, they possess a deeper understanding of the curse and, as such, can exert more control over their weaknesses, such as bloodlust and sunlight exposure. However, as the generations of vampires grow more distant from Cain, this strength diminishes. Vampires from more distant generations, known as neophytes or novices, are less skilled creatures. While still formidable, they face a number of challenges their ancestors did not. Their weakened connection to Cain makes them more vulnerable to werewolf attacks and less resistant to natural weaknesses, like garlic and sacred crosses. Additionally, they lose the ability to fully dominate the human mind, a common skill among older vampires. This decline is one of the most tragic aspects of the vampire hierarchy. As the curse spreads, it becomes more diluted, depriving younger vampires of the powers that made them legendary. It's interesting to note how this hierarchy mirrors the history of ancient civilizations, where power was concentrated in the early generations of leaders and rulers, and over time became diluted. Just as the Greek and Roman empires lost strength with each passing generation, Cain's bloodline also weakens, leaving vampires further from their ancestor at a disadvantage. This creates an intriguing dynamic within vampire society, where the more powerful elders despise the weaker ones, establishing a rigid structure of power and submission. To survive, neophytes are often forced to submit to the elders, forming alliances or living as their subordinates. This decay of the bloodline also opens a window of opportunity for werewolves. Knowing that younger vampires are weaker, they become easier prey, intensifying the rivalry between the two species. Experienced werewolves, familiar with the power structure among vampires, often target the younger generations, trying to eliminate the threat before they gain enough strength or knowledge to defend themselves. This creates a cycle of pursuit, where vampires further from Cain are forced to hide, while werewolves hunt them relentlessly. On the other hand, the vampire elders remain a constant threat. They hold the secret of creation and, as such, are virtually immortal. Battling them is challenging for any werewolf, as confronting them requires more than brute strength. It demands strategy and deep knowledge of their weaknesses. However, not all werewolves are prepared to face such powerful enemies. Furthermore, the corruption that has overtaken the werewolves over the ages has led them away from their original principles as protectors of the earth. This is where the werewolf story takes a dark turn, transforming them into hunters of their own supernatural kin. Originally, werewolves were created as children of Gaia, the earth goddess, to protect the natural balance of the world. They were the guardians of the life cycle, connected to the forces of nature, destined to hunt those who threatened this balance, primarily vampires. However, over the centuries, power began to corrupt them. The thirst to hunt vampires and their connection to brute force turned many werewolves into creatures that also started to ravage the very world they were supposed to protect. This corruption distanced them from their original mission, leading them to become predators of not only other supernatural creatures, but sometimes even humans. This moral and spiritual degeneration among werewolves is similar to what happened to vampires over generations. With each lunar cycle, the transformation connected them more deeply to their bestial nature, making it increasingly difficult for them to maintain control of their humanity. Many werewolves began acting on impulse, attacking not only vampires, but any being that crossed their path. The full moon, which once symbolized their peak connection with Gaia, became a symbol of their enslavement to their inner beast. It's as if werewolves are destined to lose themselves forever to their own rage and primal instincts. In ancient civilizations, such as the Norse and Celtic cultures, werewolves were seen as tragic figures, cursed warriors who, despite possessing devastating strength, were eternally at war with their own nature. And, like vampires, they also bear the burden of their choices. With each hunt, each death, the corruption deepens, driving them further from their original mission as protectors. This raises an interesting question about power and its capacity to corrupt even the noblest of purposes. Could it be that a werewolf's strength, which was supposed to be a blessing, is in fact a curse they will never be able to break? Despite this, some werewolves attempt to reconnect with their roots. Isolated groups, known as clans of the ancients, seek to revive Gaia's teachings, trying to live in harmony with nature and only hunt vampires that threaten the world's balance. These factions are rare and constantly hunted by other werewolves who have embraced corruption. The internal struggle among werewolves is as fierce as the war against vampires, reflecting a fragmentation that weakens them as a species. However, those who still honor their original mission represent a real threat to vampires, as they remain focused and untainted by corruption. This duality of hunter and corrupted being that defines the werewolves adds a tragic layer to their existence. They were created to protect the natural world, but in many cases, they've become uncontrolled predators. And while their rivalry with vampires is eternal, the supernatural survival of these creatures after the flood brings a new perspective to this war. What will happen when there's no more room for these cursed creatures in the world? The survival of the vampires after the great catastrophe may hold the key to understanding the next steps in this supernatural battle. The flood, described in biblical traditions as a catastrophe that swept the earth, destroyed most of humanity, but failed to eradicate the vampires. Although the flood was sent to cleanse the world of mortal sins, vampires, as descendants of Cain, were protected by a curse that bound them to eternity. While most humans were wiped out, vampires found ways to survive in the shadows, hiding in deep caves or unexplored places. This resilience showed that they were not just creatures of the night, but supernatural forces that even divine wrath could not completely annihilate. The fact that vampires survived the flood reinforces their status as natural enemies of both divine and earthly forces. Even in the face of such a destructive event, intended to reset creation, they remained untouched by the water and the purification it brought. This suggests that Cain's curse gave them more than immortality. It made them adversaries not only of humanity, but also of the celestial forces. It's as if they were a mistake even God couldn't undo, an aberration that, once created, would have to run its course until the end of time. This supernatural survival also ushered in a new era of conflict. With the earth devastated and humanity reduced, the vampires emerged into a world being rebuilt, where they could once again dominate the few remaining humans. However, the presence of the werewolves, now a more organized force focused on their purpose of hunting vampires, prevented them from fully taking control. The war between vampires and werewolves, which had previously been waged on a smaller scale, intensified after the flood, as both species competed for space and power in a reborn world. Interestingly, in the legends of other civilizations, such as Egyptian and Norse mythologies, there are stories of creatures that survived great catastrophes, whether through curses or divine intervention. In ancient Egypt, for example, it was believed that certain beings, blessed or cursed by the gods, could not be destroyed by ordinary means. The survival of vampires during the flood follows this same line of thought. The curse placed upon them made them enemies not just of humans, but of the very course of nature. It's as if they could no longer be part of the cycle of life and death, doomed to wander eternally through the shadows of a world they could never truly call home. The flood was thus a watershed moment, both literally and metaphorically, for vampires. After the catastrophe, they were no longer merely human predators. They became an existential threat to the celestial order. The werewolves, as natural hunters, understood that their mission was now more crucial than ever. The vampire's survival after such a divine disaster proved that the war between the two species was far from over. And as the world rose from the ashes, the rivalry between vampires and werewolves intensified, becoming an eternal battle. But will there ever be a winner? Or will the forces of heaven and earth continue to watch, waiting for both sides to destroy each other? The rivalry between vampires and werewolves goes far beyond a mere struggle for power or territory. It is a battle shaped by ancient curses, where the weight of guilt, pleasure, and pain defines the fate of each creature. Vampires, bearing Cain's curse, face an insatiable thirst for blood, while werewolves, born from a divine mission, find themselves trapped by their own bestial nature. This battle reflects something deep about our own internal struggles, the constant war between our instincts, our choices, and the consequences of our actions. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep diving into fascinating stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you can continue learning, discovering, and expanding your horizons on mythology, legends, and the stories behind the creatures that have fascinated us for centuries. See you next time.